A sealed wardrobe in Kensington Palace is opened after years. Inside hangs a gown once worn by the most beloved woman in modern royal history. But just as Princess Charlotte is poised to wear it for an iconic appearance, King Charles forbids it. The nation is stunned, and the palace is plunged into a storm of whispers. It began as a quiet tribute, nothing more than a mother's intention and a father's love woven into silk and memory. Princess Charlotte, now blossoming into a young woman with a poise that seemed hauntingly familiar, was to wear one of Diana's most iconic dresses during a private ceremony honoring her grandmother's legacy. The event had been planned meticulously, kept under wraps not to conceal, but to protect the sacred nature of what this moment represented. It wasn't about publicity or fanfare, it was about lineage, remembrance, and restoring a silent promise. William and Catherine, working away from the glare of the press, had personally arranged for the dress to be carefully preserved and resized for their daughter. This was not merely a fashion choice. This was heritage, a gesture layered in grief, pride, and defiance. Diana's dress, once seen as a symbol of heartbreak and strength, was now destined to rest on the shoulders of the girl who bore not just her name and lineage, but her spirit. A dress last worn during one of Diana's final public appearances, where her eyes said more than her voice ever could, was about to make its return. But what began as a private tribute quickly escalated into a royal battle. Word of the dress's return filtered through the corridors of the palace, and it didn't take long for it to reach the ears of King Charles. What followed wasn't a conversation, it was a command. With a tone sharper than protocol and colder than tradition, Charles forbade it outright. Not suggested, not advised, he forbade it. And the reasoning? Wrapped in formality and tradition, but those close to the situation whispered something far more personal behind the decision. Palace insiders revealed Charles's reaction was immediate and furious. It wasn't just about public optics, it was about control. About a past he could never quite outrun and a ghost that never seemed to leave him alone. The very thought of Diana's legacy being physically worn, embodied by his granddaughter, ignited something old and bitter inside him. This wasn't about cloth or couture. This was about power, image, and erasure. Yet his timing couldn't have been worse. Because while Charles stood as the face of a monarchy trying desperately to modernize on his terms, Diana's memory had only grown stronger over time. The dress had become more than an artifact. It was now a symbol of everything that still challenged the crown from within. Charlotte wearing that dress would mean more than just a familial tribute. It would represent a reclaiming of Diana's place within the living legacy of the monarchy. The press hadn't caught wind yet, but those within the palace could already feel the storm gathering. Charlotte herself, unaware of the political war surrounding her wardrobe, had simply smiled when told she might wear her grandmother's gown. She didn't know she was walking into the middle of a decades-old wound. But someone else did. Someone who had seen that smile before. Someone who had once watched Diana walk into rooms and light them up, only to be dimmed by royal rigidity. William. But as the order is passed down, it doesn't sit well with Prince William, who sees in Charlotte the very spark that once defined his mother. Behind the gilded doors of Buckingham Palace, tradition does not bend easily. Power, legacy, and reputation are guarded not just by protocol but by personal pride. And nowhere is this more evident than in the mind of King Charles, where the past is not history, but a shadow that refuses to fade. For him, the name Diana is not just a memory, it is a wound. A wound reopened every time the public chants her name louder than his. Every time her face graces front pages while he, the reigning monarch, is reduced to a footnote. And now, that shadow was growing again, this time in the form of a young girl whose striking poise and silent strength reminded him far too much of the woman who once defied him with nothing more than grace and honesty. Charlotte was never meant to carry that legacy, but here she was, about to step into Diana's dress and into the spotlight Charles had spent decades trying to control. Charles tried to rationalize it, to paint his opposition in colors of royal decorum and generational propriety. But those closest to him knew better. His disapproval had nothing to do with dress codes or outdated customs. It had everything to do with fear. Fear that Diana's memory cloaked in silk and carried by a child would once again outshine him. That history would repeat itself, and he would once again be the man standing silently beside a woman who commanded the love of a nation. Because no matter how high he rose, No matter how many titles he bore, Diana's name never truly left the throne. For William, however, that same name carried an entirely different weight. It wasn't fear that gripped him, it was pain, and loyalty, and love that had never dulled despite time's passing. He had spent most of his adult life walking a tightrope between honoring his mother's memory and maintaining peace within the institution that had broken her. But this latest act, this decision to forbid Charlotte from honoring her grandmother, was a line he could no longer ignore. For too long, William had bitten his tongue. For too long, he had been the obedient son, the patient heir, the silent observer of palace politics. But as he looked into Charlotte's eyes so like his mother's, something inside him cracked. The weight of years flooded in memories of watching Diana cry behind closed doors, of reading headlines that reduced her to fragments, of hearing whispers in royal corridors that painted her as the problem when all she ever wanted was to be heard. And now, that same silence was aimed at his daughter. He would not allow it. Not again. Not in his house. Not in his lifetime. Catherine, ever the voice of reason, saw the storm gathering and tried to anchor him. She reminded him of the delicacy of their position, of the press, of Camilla, of the crown. But even as she counseled caution, her heart betrayed her. She too believed Charlotte should wear the dress, that the moment belonged not to fear or formality, but to truth. And quietly, she retrieved the letters, Diana's letters to William, once tucked away for safekeeping, now pulled into the light. Letters filled with love, warnings, and most of all, a plea. Don't let them erase me. And that line, it pierced William like no royal decree ever could. Because this wasn't just about a dress, this was about legacy, about healing, about defiance wrapped in velvet and lace. And as he read his mother's words aloud to Catherine, the decision became clear not just in his mind, but in his soul. And just when the palace believed the issue would dissolve quietly, William did something no one expected. The silence didn't last long. Within days of King Charles's decree forbidding Princess Charlotte from wearing Diana's dress, something shifted inside Prince William. What began as quiet disappointment transformed into something far more dangerous. For years, William had played the part of the dutiful heir, avoiding direct confrontation with his father, choosing diplomacy over disruption. But this time, the slight wasn't aimed at him. It was aimed at his daughter, at his mother's memory, and at everything he believed the monarchy should become. And so, he did the unthinkable. He stepped out of the shadows, not with rebellion in his voice, but with reverence. At a high-profile royal engagement commemorating a charitable initiative Diana once championed, William stood before the cameras and delivered a speech that the nation would never forget. It was elegant, respectful, and unmistakably subversive. He spoke of strength passed down through generations, of women who reshaped tradition through grace and conviction. He praised a legacy that could not be silenced or shelved, a legacy that lived on in the bright, curious eyes of a girl whose future will be as fearless as the woman who came before her. There was no need to say Charlotte's name or Diana's. The world already knew, and the world reacted exactly as expected. Headlines exploded within hours. William challenges King in emotional tribute. Will Charlotte wear Diana's dress after all? Prince's speech defies palace ban. The press, long divided in its loyalty, now united in their fascination. Commentators and royal watchers pored over every word, dissecting the tone, the context, the meaning behind the glances exchanged between William and Catherine. The monarchy hadn't seen a rebellion this emotionally charged since Diana herself walked alone through landmine fields in Angola. But this was not just about symbolism, this was about reclaiming narrative. And for the first time in a long time, the power balance within the palace had visibly shifted. Catherine, known for her restraint, suddenly found herself at the heart of a media storm. Every outfit she wore, every whisper caught by reporters, every hand gesture during public appearances was now analyzed for signs of loyalty or defiance. And though she never uttered a word publicly, her silent alignment with William spoke volumes. Behind closed doors, she was firm in her stance Charlotte had the right to honor her grandmother, and the monarchy had a duty to evolve. But she also understood the danger of escalation. The wrong step could fracture the very institution they were trying to modernize. Within the palace walls, chaos reigned. Royal advisors scrambled to contain the fallout. Internal meetings stretched into late hours. The communications team issued vague statements about ongoing discussions while desperately attempting to maintain unity. But it was too late. The damage or the transformation was already underway. And at the center of it all stood King Charles, silent and increasingly withdrawn. Those closest to him noticed his demeanor darken, his temper shorten, his isolation grow deeper. Old wounds reopened. The past he had worked so hard to bury was rising again, more powerful than ever, cloaked in the image of a granddaughter and the voice of a son he no longer recognized. But while the public rallies behind William and Charlotte, a deeper reason for Charles's resistance begins to surface, and it's darker than anyone imagined. For days, the spotlight remained fixed on King Charles, portrayed as the architect of the band that divided the palace and ignited a global storm of controversy. But those attuned to the deeper currents within the monarchy knew better. Whispers subtle, almost imperceptible at first, began to echo through the halls of Buckingham and Clarence House. The decision, they said, wasn't entirely his. The emotional weight, the personal bitterness, the pointed timing it all bore the fingerprints of someone else. Someone who had always been haunted by Diana's legacy and had quietly worked for years to escape its shadow, Queen Camilla. From the moment she stepped into the spotlight beside Charles, Camilla knew that Diana's memory would not go quietly. Even after marriage, even after the coronation, Diana remained the unspoken presence at every state dinner, every gala, every whispered comparison in tabloids and public opinion. Camilla had risen, yes, but not without scars. And the most painful of all? That no matter how high she climbed, the ghost of Diana stood taller. That resentment, long buried beneath polite smiles and palace pageantry, never truly disappeared. It simmered. Sources close to the inner circle recalled private moments where Camilla pushed back against memorial efforts. On multiple occasions, she had allegedly objected to events invoking Diana's name, quietly suggesting that the monarchy needed to move forward, that too much nostalgia only reopened wounds. But the most chilling account came from a royal aide who, in a rare lapse of discretion, confessed to overhearing Camilla's reaction when news broke of Charlotte wearing Diana's dress. Her words were scathing. "We can't allow a child to wield a ghost's weapon." It wasn't just about legacy. It was about a threat. Camilla feared that once the world saw Charlotte in Diana's dress, the old narrative would return in full force, one that painted her not as queen, but as the interloper, the replacement, the reason the true princess never sat on the throne. Public sentiment had softened toward Camilla over the years, but it remained fragile. A single image of Charlotte in that gown could undo decades of cautious rehabilitation, and Camilla knew it. Then came the revelation of a private journal. Buried within a trove of old correspondence was a series of handwritten pages from Camilla herself, never meant for the public, but now circulating behind palace doors. In them, she confessed to feeling like a second act, a placeholder in a play still being written by a woman no longer living. "I stand beside him," one entry read, yet her reflection stares back at the world. The entries weren't bitter. They were broken, raw, and dangerously revealing. Faced with the threat of renewed public scrutiny, Camilla allegedly leaned on Charles with an emotional weight only she knew how to wield. She reminded him of the years of scandal, the press torment, the family divisions that Diana's death left behind. She painted the dress not as an heirloom but as a weapon. She didn't demand, she didn't order, but she leaned in with the kind of pressure that doesn't ask for a decision, it ensures one. And Charles, already teetering beneath the strain of reconciling past and present, yielded. But not everyone was convinced, and not everyone was willing to stay silent. Because while Camilla tries to tighten her grip on the narrative, someone unexpectedly steps forward to defend Diana's legacy and sends shockwaves through the monarchy. For years, Princess Anne remained the monarchy's steel backbone, unshakable, discreet, and fiercely loyal to the crown. She never courted the spotlight, she never played into public sentiment, and she never ever interfered in palace drama, no matter how turbulent. But this time, something snapped. Perhaps it was the weight of memory. Perhaps it was the sight of Charlotte composed, elegant, and silently caught in a war she never asked for. Or perhaps, after a lifetime of watching history repeat itself, Anne had simply seen enough. Whatever the reason, her silence broke. And when it did, It shattered the palace facade like glass under pressure. Because Anne didn't whisper her opinion behind velvet doors, she delivered it with unflinching clarity. And she made it known. She was standing with Diana, with Charlotte, and most shockingly, against her own brother. In a rare public statement during a press gathering at a women's leadership event, Anne was asked delicately about the recent tensions surrounding Princess Charlotte and the late Princess Diana's dress. For a moment, the room held its breath. Then came her reply, measured, unwavering, and devastating. "When we silence the past," she said, "we teach our children that legacy is shameful. My niece should not carry that burden. And my sister-in-law, a pause that hangs heavy, deserves better than to be erased." The message was unmistakable. Anne had chosen a side, and it wasn't the crown's. It was Diana's. And more importantly, it was Charlotte's. What the public didn't know, what the press only discovered later, was just how deep Anne's loyalty to Diana truly ran. In private, the two women had forged a bond that defied the rigid expectations of royal life. They spoke not as symbols, but as mothers. Anne had confided in close friends over the years about conversations she shared with Diana, conversations filled with fears about the monarchy's future and hopes for the next generation. Diana once told her, "If they don't listen to the children, the crown won't survive the noise of the world." Anne never forgot those words. And now, with Charlotte standing at the crossroads of past and future, she felt compelled to act. Her affection for Charlotte only fueled the fire. Unlike the rest of the family, Anne saw something fierce in the young girl, an uncanny blend of dignity and spirit that reminded her of Diana in the early years. To Anne, Charlotte wasn't just another royal child. She was a symbol of resilience, a living rebuttal to the narrative that only silence preserves order. When the crown attempted to erase a dress, Anne saw them erasing a voice, and she would not allow it. Her words spread like wildfire. Overnight, hashtags in support of Anne and Charlotte dominated social media. The public, already disillusioned with the cold machinery of royal image-making, rallied behind the Princess Royal with an unexpected fervor. Commentators dubbed her the unexpected heroine. Newspapers, once critical of Anne's stoicism, now praised her bravery. And within the palace, the temperature shifted dramatically. Charles, already under pressure, began to feel the walls closing in. With William openly defiant, Anne publicly dissenting, and the public aligning with both, he found himself surrounded not by allies, but by ghosts. And one of those ghosts was about to speak for herself. Because just when it seemed things couldn't escalate further, a decades-old letter from Diana resurfaces and it changes everything. In a forgotten corner of the royal archive, far from the eyes of press officers and palace aides, a sealed envelope lay untouched for over 2 decades. It had been placed there deliberately, quietly, and under strict instruction, not to be opened unless the world lost Princess Diana. It was handwritten, addressed to William, and dated just 1 month before her tragic death. And now, amid the escalating turmoil surrounding Charlotte, the dress, and the monarchy's fractured front, the envelope had finally been retrieved. What it contained was not just a mother's final message. It was a prophecy, a plea, and a request that would break William open and rebuild him all at once. The letter was simple in presentation but devastating in impact. Diana's familiar handwriting stretched across the pages with raw, unfiltered emotion. She spoke not of bitterness or revenge, but of hope. Hope that her children would be raised with strength, with compassion, and above all, with the freedom she never had. And then, in a passage that seemed almost too perfectly timed for the present moment, she wrote of a dream of a young girl in the family who, one day, would wear her dress. "A girl with the fire of freedom in her eyes," Diana wrote, "who does not bow because she was told to, but because she believes in something greater than herself. Let her wear it. Let the world remember what it costs to stand alone in truth." William read those words in silence, alone at first, then with Catherine at his side. He didn't speak. He couldn't. The room felt heavier than air. For so many years, he had buried the pain, the rage, the helplessness of watching his mother's light be dimmed. But now, she was reaching out across time, across tragedy, to remind him that her legacy was not meant to be entombed. It was meant to live. In Charlotte, in him, in that dress. Tears came without warning, and with them, resolve. This was no longer a dispute about tradition or protocol. This was his mother's final wish. Her voice, once drowned out by flashbulbs and tabloids, now roared louder than the crown. William didn't just feel compelled, he felt commanded. The dress was no longer fabric, it was on fire. And the world had already begun to see it that way. Across social media, news outlets, and public forums, the dress had gained a name. Diana's torch, they called it. A flame passed from one generation to the next, too bright to be hidden. But not everyone welcomed this resurrection. When informed of the letter's contents, King Charles refused to publicly acknowledge its authenticity. He questioned its timing, its intent, even its provenance. Some insiders say he feared the emotional tsunami it might unleash. Others believe he simply couldn't bear to be eclipsed once again by Diana, especially from beyond the grave. But in the court of public opinion, denial only added fuel to the fire. Because if Diana's words were powerful, Charles's silence was deafening. And as the monarchy braces for what seems like a full-blown rebellion, William makes the one move that shifts the entire chessboard. It began with a single announcement, but it landed like a thunderclap across the monarchy. Prince William, standing before the cameras with composure carved from conviction, declared that his daughter, Princess Charlotte, would appear at the upcoming Diana Memorial Gala. Not as a spectator, not as a supporting figure, but as a living tribute to the woman who once redefined royalty and would now do so again through the eyes of a child. He made no apologies. He sought no permission. With the world watching and the crown listening, he uttered the words that split tradition open. "Charlotte will wear my mother's dress." It was not a request. It was a reckoning. Within the palace, the reaction was instant chaos. Advisors scrambled, PR teams panicked, and Charles, blindsided, reportedly retreated into silence. But William didn't flinch. He knew what this meant. He knew the consequences. And still, he moved forward not with arrogance, but with quiet, unstoppable resolve. The dress, long hidden away and deliberately forgotten, was removed from storage. With delicate care, it was restored, its fabric revived, its details preserved. Yet something new had been stitched into its seams: resistance, redemption, and a message that the past had not been buried. It had only been waiting. As the night of the gala arrived, the world held its breath. The guest list included dignitaries, global leaders, and the most influential voices in the media. But no one commanded more attention than Charlotte. When she entered, the entire room stilled. Not because she was royal, but because she had become the embodiment of something greater, of a truth too powerful to silence. The dress, worn decades ago by Diana in her most vulnerable and radiant moments, now clung to a girl who hadn't known her grandmother, but carried her flame all the same. Catherine stood beside her, regal in her own right, yet intentionally deferential to the image her daughter now represented. There was no tension in her eyes, only pride. The kind of pride born from knowing they had broken the silence without breaking the crown. Mother and daughter, side by side, became the symbols of a legacy reclaimed. It wasn't about rebellion anymore. It was about remembrance. And that made it unstoppable. The crowd's reaction was electric. Some wept openly, overwhelmed by the collision of past and present. Others applauded with a fervor usually reserved for heroes. And around the world, the image spread like wildfire. News outlets exploded with headlines. The dress that brought Diana back. Charlotte revives the people's princess. William's stand rewrites royal history. It was no longer a question of whether Diana's legacy still mattered. It was undeniable. She was there, not in person, but in presence, in silk, in silence, in strength. And far from the lights and cheers, King Charles watched in private. Those closest to him say he didn't speak for hours, he simply stared. Crushed by the moment, conflicted by its meaning, and perhaps, deep down, aware that something irreversible had just occurred. His reign had survived scandal, tragedy, and global change. But this was something different. It wasn't a scandal, it was a shift. A new chapter written without his pen. But just as William's strike seems to solidify the future of the monarchy, the cost of rebellion begins to unfold behind closed doors. He watched it alone. No aides, no advisors, no Camilla, just King Charles and the footage that would haunt him. As Charlotte stepped into view, wrapped in the very dress he had tried to keep hidden, something inside him shattered not in rage, but in regret. The applause, the tears, the reverence that poured out for a granddaughter wearing her grandmother's legacy wasn't a triumph for the monarchy. It was a reckoning. And for Charles, it was personal. For the first time in his reign, he confronted the truth that had always lingered in the shadows. Diana had never really left, not from the public's heart, and certainly not from his own. In the days that followed, Charles withdrew, not out of strategy, but sorrow. Close confidants described him as distant, his voice subdued, his gaze hollow. Conversations behind palace walls revealed the weight he had long carried. The guilt over how things ended with Diana, the decisions he made in the name of duty, and the rise of Camilla that, no matter how justified on paper, still felt like betrayal in the eyes of the world. He had spent years trying to rewrite history by reshaping the monarchy in his own image, but Charlotte had undone all of it in a single night. Not through rebellion, but remembrance. And it stung. A meeting with William followed tense, private, and painfully human. No shouting, no lectures. Just two men standing in the quiet wreckage of their shared legacy. William stood firm, not with anger, but truth. And Charles, for all his power, had none to give in return. His eyes filled with tears, but no apology came. Only silence. Because what could be said? The past couldn't be undone. And now, the future no longer belonged to him alone. And yet, in the quiet aftermath, a new royal truth begins to take root, one that will redefine everything going forward. In the weeks that followed the gala, a quiet transformation swept through the monarchy, not imposed by decree, but born from defiance. Princess Charlotte, once just a child of royal blood, now carried something far more powerful. The hopes of a generation who remembered Diana not as a tragedy, but as a triumph. Crowds cheered her name. Commentators dubbed her the people's granddaughter, and across the world, millions saw in her not just a princess, but a phoenix rising from the ashes of a silenced legacy with grace that could not be taught. She hadn't just worn a dress, she had worn history, and in doing so, rewritten it. Kensington Palace responded to the moment not with ceremony, but with reverence. Diana's dress was officially enshrined in a new exhibit, the legacy of Lightwing, dedicated not just to the princess who once wore it, but to the future it now illuminated. Alongside it hung a simple inscription, chosen by William himself. She walked in her footsteps, so others could walk in truth. The message was clear. This was not about nostalgia. This was about purpose. William and Catherine, too, found themselves redefined. No longer seen merely as the heirs to a tired system, they became the protectors of its soul. Their stand for memory over monarchy, truth over tradition, earned them something no title could buy: trust. And for King Charles, the message landed with finality. Without fanfare, he stepped back from several royal duties, citing health and transition. But the palace knew. This was retreat, not rest. Camilla, once central to the crown's public narrative, was notably absent from all future events tied to Diana's legacy. Her silence was not accidental. It was strategic. Because the monarchy had changed, and the spotlight no longer served her. And as history rewrites itself in the face of defiance, one truth remains. No crown can ever silence the voice of a woman who changed the world and the daughter who dared to wear her fire. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.